Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ali Shihabi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Arabia Foundation. And I would like to welcome you all to our inaugural event. The Arabia Foundation is a newly established think tank in Washington, D.C. that aims to fill what we see as a gap in the knowledge and understanding of the countries of the Arabian Peninsula, particularly of Saudi Arabia. Encouraging productive and spirited debate on the topical issues of the day is one of our primary objectives. Today's discussion is particularly topical since Saudi Arabia and what Westerners call Wahhabism has gotten associated in the public narrative very often with terrorism. Given the urgency with which the problem of terrorism needs to be addressed, we felt this question worthy of serious discussion by a respected group of thought leaders. Since confusion and misperception can only delay a proper treatment of the serious problem of global terrorism. Today we're very fortunate to have a group of such thought leaders here with us. David Ignatius, who's kindly agreed to moderate, is a very well-known and prominent columnist at the Washington Post and the author of several excellent novels. David, you'll be pleased to know that I've read all your novels. Senator Chris,
so long as you bought them.
Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut is a prominent voice in the Senate on Foreign Affairs. We thank you, Senator, for taking the time from your very busy schedule in the Senate to come and talk to us today. Professors Bernard Haeckel and Gregory Gause Professor Bernard Haeckel of Princeton University and Gregory Gause of the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University are the two foremost university scholars in the West on Saudi Arabia. And Simon Henderson of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy is a well-known commentator and analyst of the Arabian Gulf region. Now, after the panel, we'll have an opportunity for questions, and I would just ask you please to put all your cell phones on silent. Thank you all for coming, and I hand it over to the moderator.
Thank you. Ali, I'm pleased to moderate this discussion. The title is pointed. Is Saudi Arabia the arsonist or the fireman when we're talking about terrorism in the region? That's the kind of pointed question that I think should bring a lively discussion. I want to ask Senator Chris Murphy to lead off. As everyone I think here knows, he's a prominent member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You cannot watch Senator Murphy on Morning Joe and not hear the phrase prospective 2020 presidential candidate attached to his name, which illustrates that he's somebody whose voice is listened to. And also, I would note he has been a very sharp critic of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as a senator. So let me ask him to lead off our discussion.
Well, David, thank you very much. This is an incredibly important moment for this new initiative. I think you're going to add tremendous value to a very robust debate that we're having in the United States, in part precipitated by the president's recent trip. And, I think what some would argue is a reorientation or a reconfirmation of an old policy in the Middle East to hew pretty close to the Saudis and to elements of the GCC. So I have been a critic, albeit one that admits that the relationship between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is an important one. Clearly, we have had for a long time a vital economic connection. We share tremendous amounts of intelligence data. Many of the plots that we have discovered with respect to extremist groups trying to attack the United States. We have done so in cooperation with the Saudis. They have played an important role to achieve a detente of sorts between Sunni nations in the region and Israel. It's in the interest of the United States as well. So, there are incredibly positive elements to our partnership. To the extent that I have been a vocal critic, it's because I think that we have largely ignored some of the malevolent influence that the Saudis and Saudi money plays in the region and worldwide when it comes to the spread of these very violent terrorist groups. Now, the Saudis do not directly fund the worst of the groups. There may be Saudi individuals that have money that flows through the family that may supply funding to some of those groups. Reports suggest that al-Nusra Front has been a direct beneficiary of Saudi funds in large numbers over the years. My critique is more about the brand of Islam that has been pushed out of Saudi Arabia. We'll talk a lot about it. I'm not the subject matter expert that my colleagues are. And I would argue the increased rather than decreased pace that we have seen this conservative, often intolerant version of Islam move across the country. If you go to the Balkans today, you will just notice in a very visual way a different place with respect to the practice of Islam than you would have seen 10 years ago. Head coverings, conservative dress, the rise of Wahhabi-funded mosques has happened with great speed. And if you stop many of the women who are now wearing covering and you ask them why they're doing so, they will tell you that they are getting paid, that they are getting a subsidy in order to practice a particular version of the religion that did not find as much favor in that place 10 years ago. And if you track that money, it comes back in some way, shape, or form to the Saudis. And if we really want to be serious about a fight against extremism, we do have to recognize that while there is no equation between sort of Salafist, Wahhabist teaching and extremism, violent extremism, those teachings, which do spread a message of intolerance towards others, does often form the building block of those extremist groups. And there are sometimes identical textual links between Wahhabi textbooks and the materials that are being handed out by some of the most vicious actors in that terrorist space. And so I think this is a really difficult conversation for the United States to have, because we don't want to be deeply involved in the conversation in the Islamic world between the different versions of the religion that get spread. But I do think we have to admit that there is a very important connection. And I think more broadly in the region, we are not well served by a U.S. policy that weighs in so definitively on the side of the Sunnis in the growing set of proxy wars between Sunni and Shia. No doubt that we have an alliance with Saudi Arabia that we do not have, nor do we wish to have, with the present regime in Iran. And there will be times at which it is in our interest to support the Sunni side of that fight for regional supremacy. But there are elements of those proxy wars that run counter to U.S. national security interests. And we will have a resolution on the floor of the United States Senate perhaps tomorrow that will propose that we reject a portion of an arms sale to Saudi Arabia that would be used inside the civil war in Yemen, which is another example of this Iranian-Saudi proxy fight that plays out in different places. In Yemen, that war has led to a humanitarian catastrophe, a radicalization of Yemenis against the United States, the growth of AQAP and ISIS. And Trump's trip, which signals that we are going to, without question, support the Sunni side of this developing set of conflicts within the region, ultimately I don't think serves our national security interests. This is a fight that ultimately will be solved, a conversation about the future of Islam in the region that has to be solved by local players. And I worry about the United States weighing in too firmly on one side, even though we clearly have that alliance with the Saudis. So I just think we should have more of this conversation in the Congress about the connection of Wahhabism to extremism. I think we should be more critical of U.S. policy that gets us in the middle of these developing proxy wars. And I think there are more rather than less of my colleagues who agree. I think you will see a very close vote tomorrow on this motion to reject the portion of the Saudi arms sale, a vote that is much closer than any of the previous iterations of the resolution.
Senator, thank you. That's a very clear and direct opening. I'm going to turn to Professor Hakel and Professor Gossa in a minute, but I want to ask Simon Henderson to go next. As I'm sure this audience knows, Simon is former Financial Times journalist, former colleague in my profession, is now a fellow with the Washington Institute for Near East Affairs, has written widely and often critically about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia over many years. So, Simon?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here today. My answer to today's question is that Saudi Arabia has been an arsonist and may still be. But we, meaning the United States and our allies, also need to work with the kingdom so that it can also be a fireman. This is a work in progress. That's the short answer. The longer answer is as follows. My specialism, as David indicated, when I'm not writing as I have been this week about Qatar, is to write about the Saudi royal family. I want today to quote from three pieces I've written which deal with the House of Saud's links to the terror attacks on the US on 9/11. On August 12, 2002, I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal entitled "The Saudi Way," which was prompted by a Saudi announcement that the US would not be allowed to use Saudi soil to launch an attack on Iraq. In the op-ed, I referred to a January 9, 2002 story in the US News and World Report entitled "Princely Payments." In my piece, I said the story provided a lead which few had followed up. I quote from my piece, "Two unidentified Clinton administration officials told the magazine that two senior Saudi princes had been paying off Osama bin Laden since the 1995 bombing in Riyadh, which killed 5 American military advisors. A Saudi official was quoted as saying, 'Where's the evidence? Nobody offers proof. There's no paper trail.' I continued in my Wall Street Journal piece. I followed the lead and quickly found US and British officials to tell me the names of the two senior princes. They were using Saudi official money, not their own, to pay off bin Laden, to cause trouble elsewhere, but not in the kingdom. That, I argued, is the Saudi way. I wrote, the amounts involved were, quote, hundreds of millions of dollars, unquote, and it continued after September 11, 2001. I asked a British official recently, I wrote in that op-ed, whether the payments had stopped. He said he hoped they had, but was not sure. It was another 3 years before I named the princes involved, and then only obliquely. They were, after all, still alive. In a further Wall Street Journal article, or op-ed, entitled "Saudi Brezhnevs," dated August 3, 2005, and prompted by the death of King Fahd on August 1, I wrote, quote, "Washington makes little secret of not wanting either Sultan or Naif to be king. Neither is considered modern enough. Both are thought to have made past compromises with Al-Qaeda to redirect the threat to the kingdom onto US interests." End quote. I used this material when the famous or infamous 28 pages of the congressional 9/11 investigation were published in July last year. In a piece I wrote for Foreign Policy entitled "What We Know About Saudi Arabia's Role in 9/11, I noted the words from page 436 when Treasury General Counsel David Aufhauser had testified that, quotes, offices of Al-Haramain, noted as being a Saudi charity, have significant contacts with extremists, Islamic extremists. This previously secret paragraph went on to quote unnamed CIA officials as testifying that the head of the central office of Al-Haramain is complicit in supporting terrorism. And, to continue the quote, it also raised questions about Prince Knife, unquote. I concluded my foreign policy article by saying that the Saudi or even official US claims of there being no evidence to indicate the Saudi government as an institution or senior officials individually had supported the 9/11 attacks left open the possibility, indeed the probability, that the actions of senior Saudis resulted in the terrorist outrages. I went on in the foreign policy piece, quote, I have never suggested that the Saudi government or members of the royal family directly supported or financed the 9/11 attacks, but official Saudi money ended up in the pockets of the attackers without a doubt. I continued, I once asked a British official, how do we know? He replied, we know what account the money came out of and where it ended up. I should point out in parenthesis that this particular official died not so long ago and was the subject of at least one fairly significant obituary. There is little doubt that Iran will blame Saudi Arabia for today's terrorist events in Tehran. Indeed, I understand the Revolutionary Guard has already done so. Riyadh will equally surely angrily deny it. Here in the United States, despite the efforts of many to end the discussion, the debate about Saudi official involvement in 9/11 continues. For me, there are two main questions. One, how can Saudi Arabia make amends for its culpability in the attacks on that September day almost 16 years ago? And two, how can help or assist, how can we help or assist or insist that Saudi Arabia does even more to stop this terrorism, which is so dangerous to the region and even to the world's future? Thank you.
I want to turn now to two of the academic experts on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that I respect most and listen to most closely. And let me begin with Bernard Haeckel, a professor at Princeton, and ask Bernie to respond to our fundamental question, arsonist or firemen, and to address the points that Senator Murphy and Simon have made.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I should just immediately actually respond to what just Simon said, and then I'll get into the substance of my of what I wanted to say. I know the heads, number 2, number 1 of British intelligence, otherwise known as SIS. And I've known them since I was a graduate student at Oxford in the early mid-90s. In fact, they tried to recruit me, and I turned them down. At no point in all of these conversations has anything approximating what Simon has said been mentioned to me. I can mention the names of the individuals in questions if you like, but at no point was there any proof adduced to the fact that members of the Saudi royal family were funding Al-Qaeda not to attack the kingdom, but rather to attack the United States. It beggars belief that a country that depends on its security for an American umbrella would actually wish to attack the United States. It just doesn't make sense. It's illogical. And to persist in this kind of line of argumentation reminds me a lot of the conspiracy theories that have to do with the murder of John F. President Kennedy. It just simply does not hold water. Now let me turn to the substance of what I wanted to say. I'm a historian, and I'm a historian both of the Middle East and of Islam. And my biggest worry with the argument and the connection that is made between Wahhabism or Salafism, as it is called in the kingdom and around the world, and terrorism, is that it's very simplistic. It's catchy. It gives you it fools you into thinking that there's a silver bullet solution to the global problem of terror. So let me wear my historian's cap for just 1 second. The Saudis have been funding an intolerant form of their faith since 1925. The violence that we see associated with Salafis doesn't begin till the 1990s. In fact, the violence that is associated with Islamists it begins in the 1970s with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And Al-Qaeda's leadership and its core ideology is much more influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Egyptian movement dating back to the 1920s, than it has to do with Salafism. And I'll get to why why a lot of the terrorist groups focus on Salafism. And there's a very good reason for that, and which is that their principal target is Saudi Arabia. There is nothing that excites jihadists more than to be able to control the two great mosques of Mecca and Medina and the oil fields of the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. In fact, if you look at bin Laden's diary, and I've looked at his diary, in the year 2000, he had a fantasy about what he would do with the oil wealth of Saudi Arabia and how he would use that oil wealth to propagate his form of Islam throughout the world. So going back to the silver bullet question, there is a proposal in this town and in the media, and that appeals to liberals, which is that there are these bad Muslims. They're called Wahhabis or Salafis. And then there are, other Muslims. If you're pro-Iranian, then, you say that Iran is this great country and its form of Islam is peaceful and nonviolent, and that the Saudis are the culprits. In fact, if you look at this global Islamic revival, and that is what it is, there's a global Islamic revival. And the reason for this global Islamic revival is complex. And because it's complex, it's difficult to capture in a kind of soundbite. And the complexity of the global Islamic revival has to do with the following elements. First, you have autocratic, brutal regimes throughout the Middle East that have brutalized their population, that haven't given good governance, haven't given transparency and accountability when it comes to rule. Second, you've had the collapse of other ideologies, liberal ideologies, socialist ideologies. Third, you have a complicity between the United States and countries like Saudi Arabia, but also other countries in the Middle East, to promote Islam as an antidote to communism. And we cannot exclude the culpability of the United States, not only for what it did during the Cold War in promoting Islam as an ideology, a political ideology against communism, but also, more importantly, the smashing and destruction of the Iraqi state in 2003. Now, if you look at the landscape of the Middle East today, let's take the countries that have produced the most jihadists: Iraq, Syria, Libya, Tunisia. In none of these countries has Saudi Arabia been allowed to build a single mosque, build a single madrasa, propagate its own school textbooks, pay imams, or buy off women to wear veils, which I find kind of slightly, I find it incredible to believe that the Saudis have enough money to pay for women to cover their heads. I think that people's faith cannot be bought. I think people turn to Salafism for reasons that have to do with political, personal reasons, and that you can't build a mosque or force people to turn to a particular form of the faith. And in the case of Pakistan, which I know, Senator, you have talked about in the madrasas there, the form of Islamism and jihadism that we have in Pakistan and Afghanistan is the Taliban. And that has nothing to do with Salafism. It's a whole other branch of Islamic revivalist thinking that dates back to the 19th century in India. And so this is just to say that the question of terrorism and intolerance and a particular form of Islam is just not easy to capture or to put your finger on. It is a global Muslim revival. Aspects of that revival have to do with violence. The people who are violent sometimes and often associate themselves with Salafism because they want Saudi Arabia, they want to target that country, and also because there are particular forms of the faith that make Salafism appealing to those who wish to be violent. But to reduce this very complicated phenomenon that we are all suffering from to either one country or one form of the faith, or to intolerance, because not all intolerant people are violent. In fact, most Salafis are not, is, I think, to do an injustice to the complexity of the history of this part of the world and to the political problem that we are facing today.
Thank you, Professor Hakel. I now want to ask Professor Gauss from Texas A&M, where he heads the George W. Bush Center, to conclude this set of opening comments, and then we'll have a conversation among ourselves, and then we will, I promise, turn to the audience for your questions. But
just one
Greg.
brief correction. I'm at the George H.W. Bush School, and there's a big difference between George H.W. Bush and George W.
They all look really good these days.
Apologies to 41
to all
and
the
to Greg.
Bushes, yeah. So everything worthwhile has been said, but it hasn't been said by me. So here I go. I think that the whole issue of the spread of Salafism is one of the most important things that's happened in the Muslim world as part of the Muslim revival that we've seen in the last half century. And I think that if you take a 50 or 60-year time horizon, Saudi Arabia has a lot to answer for on this. Saudi Arabia has been funding this intolerant and puritanical and xenophobic form of Islam all over the world. There's no question about that. Moreover, Saudi Arabia provided a model for how one could organize a Muslim state. And while us good liberals in the United States wouldn't want to live in Saudi Arabia, right, there's plenty of people from around the Muslim world who lived in Saudi Arabia, who studied there, who said, yeah, this is the way a Muslim society should work. It's relatively prosperous, it's relatively peaceful, things work. This is a good model. So the whole attraction of Salafism, yes, it does in some large measure, not completely, but in some large measure, go back to Saudi Arabia. But I think if we take a 15-year time horizon, right, we have to acknowledge that whatever control, to the extent that the Saudis had control over global Salafism in the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s, basically by the 1990s is broken. Right? Bernie mentioned that the jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union was, I think, a really important turning point in this development, because there you get this dangerous cocktail formed, right? Pardon me for those who are good Muslims out there for me to use the word cocktail in explaining an ideological development in the faith, but I think that there's this cocktail got formed, right, of the political activism of the Muslim Brotherhood, right, with this extremely strict puritanical scripturalist interpretation of what Islam means for everyday life that Salafism and Saudi Salafism brings. And this was represented by the marriage, literally the marriage, metaphorical marriage of Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, right? The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and a scion of one of the richest families in Saudi Arabia. In that crux, in that crucible of a jihad against the Soviet Union, which, as Bernie pointed out, we thought was a great idea, I think was born this very combustible Salafi jihadist mix. Right? Saudi Arabia lost control of that. And we can see, not just in terms of Salafi jihadism, but in the various ways that Salafism has expressed itself politically throughout the region, that this has become, right, a global movement that's united by a few core notions of what Islam means for public life, having to do with the way you dress, having to do with the role of women, having to do with the role of Sharia in society, but has taken enormously different political courses, right? In Egypt, right, during the one free parliamentary election we had in Egypt, right, The Salafis won 25% of the seats, joined in a democratic process, and sat in parliament. In Tunisia, the Salafi movement rejected the democratic transition, and Tunisia produces, per capita, the largest number of fighters in Syria that we've seen, right? Largest number of jihadists, right? In a Gulf state like Kuwait, the Salafis sit in parliament, right? In Saudi Arabia, good Salafis say democracy is against Islam. But in other parts of the world, Salafis are participating in democratic politics. In other parts of the world, Salafis are blowing themselves up and killing other people. I think that it would be a mistake for us to fall in the trap that so many governments in the Middle East want us to fall into, which is that there's a single cause explaining the turmoil in the region, right? Today, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard said Saudi Arabia was responsible for the attack on the Iranian parliament, right? The Saudis and the Emiratis are, God help us, blaming Qatar for the rise of Islamist opposition groups, right? The Egyptians blame Qatar for the strength of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, an organization that was founded in Egypt, right? Won a presidential election in Egypt, got 48% of the seats in the one free parliamentary election that happened in Egypt. Qatar can't create that. Do these countries have a role in supporting these groups? Without a doubt. Right? But it's a lot more complicated than to say that there's a single cause and one kind of foreign power behind all of this. So, where does that leave the United States and Saudi Arabia? It seems to me that we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions going forward. One is, what are American interests in this part of the world? It seems to me that we have a couple of core interests. One of which is the continuation of the free flow of energy from the Gulf region. I mean, that's been true since World War II. Another is that no single power, except us, of course, comes to dominate that part of the world. And now thirdly, to reduce the chances of radicalism emerging from that region that can attack us, our allies, in the region and elsewhere. Where does this radicalism come from? A number of causes, but it seems to me that the core issue right now is the collapse of state authority in the region. The collapse of state authority in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, perhaps in Sinai. And it behooves the United States to deal with countries that actually govern their society and have some influence on what happens outside their borders. That's why I thought that the nuclear deal with Iran was a great idea. Thought it was a really important thing for the United States to deal with the Iranian government, which has influence throughout the region, but also has an address and a phone number, right? Unlike ISIS and Al-Qaeda, right? Iran has an address and a phone number, and you can deal with them. Right? I think the same holds true with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has an address and a phone number and a much longer history of cooperating with the United States. And thus, I think it's essential for the United States to deal with Saudi Arabia in a realistic, clear-eyed way. When we find instances where Saudi money is going places, right, that encourage radicalism and violence and terrorism, we call the Saudis on it. My understanding is that when we bring specific evidence to the Saudis of the way their money and their people are being used, they do something about it. But I think it's counterproductive for us to say, you have to either not be Wahhabis, right? Tell the Iranians not to be Shia, right? Tell folks where I come from in Texas not to go to their evangelical church, right? Because you don't like the politics that comes from that. That's not going to do any good. Nobody's going to respond to that. I think we deal with these things. The more specifically we can give the Saudis our criticisms and what we think that they need to do, I think the better the relationship will be. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. So I want to take the opening comments and the sharp, clear statements and see if we can focus down a little bit. And let me start with Senator Murphy. President Trump's visit to the kingdom several weeks ago included, with much fanfare, the signing of a counterterrorism pledge to cease financing, including through private individuals, extremist groups by the GCC member countries. One of the centerpieces of the trip. So I want to ask you to begin assessing that. Did you find that pledge credible? How do you think the United States should hold the nominal signatories of that pact to account in terms of whether they carry it out?
I think it's important, but insufficient. And I think this last point is, maybe the most interesting, which is a question of what we should be expecting from the Saudis, right? Should we be expecting that they merely refrain from financing directly groups that have immediate links to terrorism? Should we expect that they make sure that no one that ends up with money that emanates from the royal family, charities, individuals, support those organizations? Or should we expect that they be more careful and more deliberate about the money that goes to spread the version of Islam that we're all talking about here, which in many forms does not have any direct connection to those organizations? I think we certainly should expect them to do the first two. And I would argue that this has not been our primary ask of the Saudis in many of the conversations we have had with them. I mean, recent reports suggest that there is direct money flowing from members of the Saudi infrastructure into al-Nusra, which is a wing of al-Qaeda that many of the groups that we finance would like to see have less power and less influence inside the Syrian civil war. But I would still argue that the third should be on the table as well. And again, I think it's a very uncomfortable place for the United States to be. But given the fact that we are putting $110 billion of arms in a conversation with the Saudis, I think our leverage is not insignificant. And I don't think it's inappropriate for us to talk to them about the detriment to the United States that accrues as this version of Islam spreads fast, far, and wide. So I think your focus should be on the first two, making sure that no Saudi money goes to groups with links to extremists, making sure that no Saudi money indirectly goes to those groups. But I do think the third is important as well.
So, Senator Leahy, just briefly follow up. One of the really striking events of the last few years in terms of U.S.-Saudi relations was the congressional vote on JASTA. And it just showed a fundamental lack of support in Congress for U.S.-Saudi relations and concern about the issues you raised at the outset. We have a new administration. We have a president who has just gone to Saudi Arabia, and it's been the most visible demonstration of American presidential support for the kingdom I can remember. If you were to poll Congress today, including your Republican colleagues, would you find different numbers and any change in the picture that JASTA gave us?
I don't know that JASTA is a completely accurate representation of the full thought of members of Congress on the question of Saudi Arabia, in part because it is sort of tied together with this sort of seminal emotional moment in American modern political history, that of September 11th. And so, that vote happened just days before a resolution that would stop a previous arms sale to the Saudis, which failed on a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 margin. And so I still think that there is significant support for Saudis and a lot of members who don't want to ask these questions, notwithstanding the vote on JASTA. And I guess my worry is that, well, it was right for the president to go and ask all of these countries to sign this pledge, as has been the case. Within a week, the Twitter feed suggests a reversal of policy. So this week, the president seems to be blaming all of the problems of extremism on Qatar and on Iran. And while Qatar and Iran certainly have to answer for themselves, after just having done something constructive to recognize the role of many of the nations at that table to fund extremist groups, he now seems to be simplifying this equation down into one that points the blame straight at the Iranians and anyone who seeks to have any conversation, alliance, or connection to the Iranians.
I want to ask our area experts, all three of them, to speak to the question about whether there is something new happening in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia under King Salman. Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been a visible and fairly open advocate of change. I interviewed him within the last few weeks, and he said some things on the record that were quotable. The question, I'll start with you, Bernie, is whether you think this public statement, commitment to change, has deep roots and is in fact bringing change.
So, my sense, and I like you, I have met him as well. My sense is that he, and this is true for the entire Saudi royal family, they realize that there is a constituency in the country that is deeply conservative, maybe even reactionary, that doesn't want to see change. And that there are certain key issues that are wedge issues, like women's driving is one of them, that stand for more than just the issue itself of whether women can drive or not, but rather represent how powerful and significant and influential this conservative constituency is. The Deputy Crown Prince is a man who wants to see the kingdom's economy become diversified, and he wants to see economic reform. He realizes for that to happen, for instance, women must be allowed to work in large numbers, because women in Saudi Arabia are the better educated, the harder working, the more disciplined segment of society. There are more of them at universities, for instance. So he wants to push an economic reform in which you will see social reform and you will see women participating in larger numbers, but he can't put it in terms of women's liberation, because that's just that won't cut ice with the conservative and religious elements in society who are real. I mean, this is not just an invention of the royal family, that there are deeply reactionary groups and large segments of the population. So I'm hopeful in that economic reform and necessity and the decoupling from this huge dependence on oil revenue is going to push them in that direction, whether they like it or not, the entire society. And in the past, if you look at Saudi history, every time something new came up, whether it's women's education, the radio or the telegraph before that, after that television, satellite television, the religious elements in society were extremely hostile, started issuing fatwas about how un-Islamic all of this was and so on, but eventually relented. And in fact, today, if you were to go to any of these religious types and say, you know what, I'm going to take your daughters out of school, they would, you'd have a riot in the country because they've taken it as an entitlement, as a right. Whereas, 50 years ago, they were dead set against it and were willing to anathematize, in other words, declare non-Muslim the ruler of the country for pushing this agenda. So I'm hopeful.
Greg, let me ask you the same question and maybe add a particular question. I'd be curious about your views and Simon's. Saudi Arabia's political, cultural, religious structure, analysts often say, has been based on a basic alliance between the religious leadership, the ulama, and the House of Saud, the royal family. And that alliance has led to some of the problems that we've been discussing this afternoon. And I want to ask you whether you see, under the current leadership, any sign that basic pact is changing, that the balance is shifting in ways that would allow some opening of society beyond the economic diversification that Bernie talked about.
You want me to go
Please,
first,
yes.
David?
You go first and then
Yeah,
Simon.
sure. It was never an equal alliance. And when big oil money came in the 70s, the ulama became state employees just like other state employees. Now, they can mobilize sentiment in the society, as Bernie said, but they are part of the state bureaucracy. And it's interesting to note that when the government cracks the whip, these guys fall in line. Not only do the state employees fall in line, but even those guys who are kind of in between the Al-Qaeda types and the loyal state employees, right? Those Salafi activists that were called the Awakening Movement in the 80s and 90s, whose names are familiar to people who follow Saudi and probably not to anybody else. When they thought that this regime was in trouble after 9/11 and the critical gaze of the world was turned on them, these guys all rallied to the regime because none of them can imagine, except the most extreme like bin Laden, none of them can imagine a Salafi Arabia not ruled by the House of Saud. So I think there's an alliance here, but it's not an equal alliance. The family basically, the government basically has the upper hand on these guys. And they're not the only part of the alliance, right? There's also state employees, more quote unquote liberal in the Saudi context, folks who look to the government to hold back these more socially conservative and reactionary folks. This government has been able to build a very effective patronage network and keep its society more divided, I would say. I mean, why did we not see uprisings and protests in Saudi Arabia in 2011 the way we saw it in so many other states? Saudi Arabia, probably the one major Arab state that didn't see major popular protests. Well, partially it's because oil was $140 a barrel, and the Saudis, unlike Gaddafi, they spent that money on people to let them know that they would be taken care of. But it's also because people in Saudi Arabia don't have that fundamental trust with one another. Right? That a country like Tunisia or Egypt, where you have a stronger sense of nationalism, people across ideological lines and class lines come into the streets because they have confidence in each other. Maybe that confidence is misplaced. But the Saudi government has been kind of the hub of the spokes, of which the religious establishment is just one. Let me just add one more point. I think Senator Murphy set out a number of things that we want the Saudis to do. I want them to do one more thing. Right? If they're going to be Salafis and have an official Salafi religious establishment, let's use that establishment to delegitimize the interpretations of Islam that lead to violence. And I think the Saudis have been okay, maybe a B on that so far. But I think that what we can expect them to do within the Salafi community is to use their ideological resources to discredit these more extremist and violent interpretations. And we should add that to the checklist of what we expect them to do.
Simon, give us your sense of what's happening in the kingdom, prospects for reform or lack of reform. What's your judgment?
My judgment is that MBS, Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the favorite son of the king, 31 years old, wants change. The particular change he wants, though, is to be king. And so he's trying to orchestrate that. And one of the ways of orchestrating that is by being the architect of this or that. He's tried being the architect of the Yemen war. That turned out to be a disaster. And so his hands are not, his fingerprints are no longer noticeably on the Yemen war. And he's come up with Vision 2030. Saudi Arabia needs economic change, it needs economic development, even transformation. Other people have tried it in the past with varying degrees of success and failure. The buildings which they built, king this, king that, city for development, etc., are there in the sands, half empty. The question is whether Mohammed bin Salman has the energy and indeed the success to continue this economic transformation forward. There are a couple of major problems for him. One is to make an economic transformation, you need cash in order to invest on the changes. With the oil price low, there ain't much cash around. And secondly, he has to carefully judge his relationship with his elder cousin, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Naif, who frankly, as far as I can make out, also wants to be king, and whose main tactic for ensuring that he is king rather than his upstart younger cousin is to wait for MBS to make yet another mistake, and one which is impossible for the king to sort of say doesn't matter and give him yet another project to do. To bring this on to the ulama, I think it's a fascinating dimension. My working understanding is that ulama are crucial at a certain level of legitimizing the authority of the House of Saud, the custodianship of the two holy places, and that's very useful. But at a time like this, when there are all sorts of changes being mooted, such as women going to be having an even greater participation in the workforce, which would mean that the division of the sexes in workplaces is even harder to make sure it happens, and also entertainment, live entertainment. This will be antagonistic to, as people have suggested, sectors of Saudi society. And I suspect they're just biding their time. There's a little bit of criticism coming out of them, but they probably think the best way of doing it, in a similar way to the way that MBN is doing it, is waiting for MBS to make a mistake.
I want to ask, before we leave this question, to ask Bernie to think about the issues that all of the speakers, but in particular Simon, have raised about the staying power of the reform process that the Deputy Crown Prince is associated with. The issue that's been raised is there the staying power, and also is the Saudi royal family united enough or pushed back enough that these have a real chance? And so I'd ask you to speak to that.
I mean, look, it's a very difficult question to answer. Partly it will have to do with the price of oil. So, you know, in a world where, let's say, oil, unlikely, goes back up to $100, $150 a barrel, my reading of Saudi history, political history, is that they will throw money at the problem and kick the reforms, the can of reforms down the road, because those are really hard things to do. I mean, what he wants to do is an upheaval of the entire society in its relationship with the government. He wants to diminish, you know, 2/3 of Saudis working Saudis work for the government in the public sector. He wants to make the private sector the more important employer in the economy. I mean, that's a big lift. So the answer partly has to do with where oil is. Now, if oil remains where it is today, which is roughly around 50, change has to happen, or else they're going to hit a wall, at 100 miles an hour, and it will be a disaster for the country. And I think that's something that he himself has said, which is that if we don't do this, it's over for us, because we can no longer live off of the rents that just come from oil. The other thing I would add to this is that my sense of the prince is that he is hugely influenced by the UAE and by what he sees in places like Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but also Singapore. I think his idea is that he wants to have a society that is economically dynamic, but still autocratic in its political in its political form. You know, whether he pulls it off is, you know, he's much bigger than the UAE in terms of size and population. The UAE those are city-states. They can throw money at their problem and kind of make the problem go away. Saudi Arabia is a much bigger country in that respect. Now, as far as the royal family is concerned, look, I think every Saudi male prince wants to be king. So there's nothing unique about MBS or MBN or any other of them wanting to be king. What we do see, though, with MBS, and this is something that I think is new. It's both old and new, in that he is consolidating power. You have a consolidation of power under King Salman that hasn't been seen since the time of the founder king, King Abdulaziz, who died in 1953. After the death of the founder king, you basically had power dissipated and shared by a number of brothers who were roughly of the same age. Those brothers are no longer really around. And now you have a consolidation under what is, again, an absolutist monarchy. And that's new. And what it means is that if he's successful in consolidating power, that it doesn't really matter what other Saudi royals think, because he will be the one in control. Or whoever the king is will be the person in control. And you will no longer revert to the system where consensus building and sharing power is required.
So I want to turn to the audience. It's been a very wide open set of comments so far, and in the spirit of continuing that, invite questions from you. I see my friend Judith Kipper. Let me call on Judith.
Senator Murphy, you talked about our arms sales to Saudi Arabia giving us leverage, but isn't the opposite true as well? The 100 CEOs or whatever it was that went with the president, the $110 billion and previous and future arms sales, doesn't that make our governing officials who have some of those corporations in their states a little reluctant to talk to the Saudis about the 4 issues that you and Greg talked about? And if I may, David, just add a related question. It seems to me money talks. None of you, the 5 of you, spoke about petrodollars. Petrodollars, wealth without work. Not all that long ago, and they're still living on that mythology, didn't produce institutions, modern or good education, any kind of participation or civil society. It produced greed and building, white elephant projects and a lot of buildings and so on. But the underdevelopment in the Arab world, even in those countries like the Gulf that look modern, have good roads, so far behind the rest of the world that it's really staggering considering the amount of money they have. And I think we have to talk about money, because when the money came is also when the bad stuff started to happen.
Well, I mean, I guess some of us maybe think it just goes without saying. I mean, the reason why you're all here and why we're all up here is because of oil. I mean, we wouldn't be having an in-depth conversation about the status. No, I understand, but we wouldn't. I don't know that we would be having this kind of in-depth conversation about Saudi Arabia with decades worth of foreign policy expertise if it wasn't for the fact that the United States has been anchored in that region for a very long time because of the fact that we run our country based off of a product that comes from it. I think you are right that the leverage does go both ways, and we should also admit that even inside that arms sale, this is not simply the Saudis begging us for offensive weapons. This is part of a strategy that the Trump administration, in some ways inherited from the Obama administration to transfer military responsibility for the region from the United States to our partners. And so we are giving them the weapons in part because we've asked them to take on these fights that we used to be the guarantor for. And that, I think, is an important underlying premise of our policy towards the Middle East to question as to whether or not that's wise for us to do that. But I think you are right that, I shouldn't overstate the leverage we have because it does go both ways, and we have an interest ultimately in giving them these weapons. And so, that does mean we probably have to prioritize our asks.
Yes, Greg, maybe to respond to the other part of Judith's question about petrodollars. A big part of the MBS reform program is this idea of selling a share, 5% maybe, of Saudi Aramco into our private capital markets to raise money that goes with the implicit requirement that Saudi Aramco meet capital market transparency standards, that's a different situation. Greg, just briefly, do you think that that's realistic and that the markets, A, can absorb it, and B, that Saudi Aramco is really ready for it?
Boy, if I had the answer to that question, David, I'd be getting a lot more money than I'm paid. I think that the IPO is going to go through because, as Bernie pointed out, the most important decision maker in Saudi Arabia now wants it to go through. And it is part of an economic diversification strategy, right? Don't have that oil generate cash flow only, but have it also generate a big chunk of money for investment. Investment at home, investment in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and other places that the president would like to see it go. I actually think in the talks about this, the money that's supposedly going to be generated from the 5% IPO of Aramco has been promised about 200%. But I think that it's part of a vision that Mohammed bin Salman, who is an economic reformer, as Bernie said, not a political reformer, he's an autocrat. And if you're going to have change in these places, you need autocratic power to some extent. But I think that it will be very difficult for Saudi Aramco, which is a very, very well-run part of the Saudi economy and a very, very well-run international oil company, to kind of change to the kinds of transparency that international investors would want to know, just what they're getting for their 5%. And, when the dividends get declared, they're going to want to see the profit sheets to make sure that they're getting that cut. I think that's going to be very difficult, but not impossible, because the corporate ethos of Saudi Aramco is actually, I think, very strong. I think that the bigger problem here is that economic reform in Saudi Arabia, change to a more productive economy, to answer Judith's question about petrodollars and underdevelopment, requires not just a change in Saudi Aramco and where the money goes. The whole Saudi private sector, which has been a job-generating machine, probably 1 million jobs generated in the last decade in the Saudi private sector. The issue, though, is that 90% of them went to foreigners. Right? The business model of the Saudi private sector relies upon relatively cheap foreign labor. So you're going to have to impose a wrenching change on the Saudi private sector to make them the employer of first resort for Saudis. And I think that that's going to be an extremely difficult thing. And Vision 2030 has set goals on that score, but it hasn't really kind of grappled with the policy changes necessary to raise the cost of foreign labor sufficiently to make that the only choice that the private sector has. That I think is the real issue in economic reform.
Go back to our audience, and I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions and then come back to the panel. The young lady in the second row first.
My name is Jane. I have a question for Dr. Hakel. So you basically were saying that we should isolate Saudi Arabia from the Muslim Brotherhood, the Syrian jihadists, Taliban, 9/11, so on. But I mean, how can we do that with the Muslim Brotherhood when they've been funded by Saudi since 1990? And there was even a motion in 2016 to remove them from the terrorist list. And then you said that most of the jihadis don't come from Saudi Arabia, they come from Syria. Well, the jihadists in Syria are Saudis. The Saudis make up the second largest group. And then you also said, it doesn't make any logic that, Saudi Arabia would have any involvement in terrorism. But I mean, look what we've created. We created a war on terror that has just destabilized Syria and Iraq, and now Saudi Arabia is the leading power in the region. So isn't it to their benefit of this whole war on terror?
I'm Eric Uvorsi with the Center for International Policy. This is a question for Mr. Henderson, but also anyone on the panel. You mentioned in your initial remarks about exporting this Salafi idea. You talked about Al-Qaeda and 9/11. I think a lot of these issues are rooted more in the sense of authoritarianism and people going against the monarchy as opposed to just being Salafi. You could look at Juhayman's siege of the Great Mosque of Mecca, where he invoked jihad to go against what he felt was the Saudis not following through on following his Salafi interpretation of Islam. You could go to Bin Laden when he went to the House of Saud and said, "I will protect you from Saddam Hussein if he comes south," and they said, "We need American security here, we don't need you." The Sahwa, when they said, "We don't want Westerners on Muslim soil," and then they were repressed by the Saudi state. So a lot of these kind of show a strong sense of Saudi co-optation and coercion. So how much of this debate do you think is rooted in Salafi jihad as opposed to lack of democracy, a repressive state, lack of freedoms? And could you also talk a little bit about how strong you think the Saudi state is in terms of coercion and co-optation currently? Thank you.
Yes, Aberdeen from Rapid Corporation. You know, I went to the Gulf in the 70s. I covered Saudi Arabia in the Gulf. And to me, the economic transformation it's amazing in all spheres, universities, healthcare, road networks, everything. So, I see what's more positive than the negativity about the economics, what's going on in the region. Can somebody comment?
Simon, do you want to begin?
Not particularly, but I will. It forces me to do that very British thing, which always bemuses Washingtonians, which is to say, I don't know. And frankly, I don't know because I don't particularly look at that particular dimension of Saudi life, although I understand the question, and I think it's an interesting question, perhaps even an important one as well. I think the spin that I'd like to put on the question, shove it in the direction where I think it's more relevant to today, is that the House of Saud, or Saudi Arabia as a country, the House of Saud as the ruling part of that country, fears Iran, perhaps rightly so, perhaps they're not paranoid. And this is a schism which, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which also has an important religious divide as well between Sunni and Shia. And I think that is a reason why, or produces a result which is an internal division in the kingdom between the pesky Shiites who live in the eastern province, inconvenient where the oil is as well, and the Sunni vast majority who regard the Shiites as either not proper Muslims or far too friendly to Iran. And that is a great danger to not only the internal politics, or the internal social dimensions of the country, but also externally today as much as in the future.
Other comments, Greg?
So I'll just briefly take on this idea that repression leads to the rise of jihadist opposition. I don't think that that's the way it works. Saudi Arabia produces a lot of jihadists that go to Syria, no question about it. Tunisia does too, and Tunisia is the most successful democratic experiment to come out of, the only successful democratic experiment to come out of the Arab Spring. The guys who perpetrated the outrageous attacks in London a couple of days ago, and the people who did it in France months ago, and the various attacks there, they grew up in democratic societies. Obviously not feeling completely included in these societies. They grew up in democratic societies. So I've always been very skeptical about the notion that if you just have a more democratic and open society, you're not going to have terrorism. In fact, the early literature in the social science on terrorism, which came out in the 70s, late 70s and into the 80s, actually said there was a correlation between democracy and terrorism, because where did we have the most vibrant terrorist groups? Europe. Baader-Meinhof, Red Brigades, IRA, all that. So I don't really see a regime-type connection.
Bernie?
Yeah, I just want to briefly, I think I was misunderstood, perhaps deliberately. Look, I don't think that, and I study jihadism, and I've been studying Salafism, for nearly 30 years now. And I've met a lot of the Al-Qaeda people who came back to Yemen after the jihad, Afghani jihad in the 1980s, when I was a Fulbright in Yemen. I don't think that any one group or sect in Islam has a monopoly on violence or on intolerance. You have jihadis who are Shiites, you have intolerance amongst Shiites, you have intolerance amongst Sunnis, you have jihadis amongst all branches of Sunnism, including the Sufis, by the way, who everyone thinks are nice and soft and cuddly. All the jihads against European colonialism were led by Sufis. So if you have any historical sensibility for the Muslim world and for the history of Islam, you realize that to confine terror to one group or one country is wrong. It's just simply misleading. The other thing that I want to say is that terrorism and that kind of violence is not just about ideas. It doesn't just emerge from ideas. You need to have a social and political and historical context for it to emerge and to arise. So for instance, and to put it very crudely to you, I don't imagine, and in fact I can with certainty tell you that there would be no ISIS had the Iraqi state not been smashed by the Americans in 2003. Right? So you need to have something happen, a particular community be disenfranchised, a particular kind of sectarian violence directed at Sunni Iraqis, for ISIS to find, for that idea to find the soil, a fertile soil from which a movement like ISIS can grow. So I'm arguing for more subtlety and more, because if you really want to fight terrorism and you want to fight Islamic radicalism, you have to understand it. You have to understand where it comes from and why it's there, not just sort of throw labels around and think that there are silver bullet solutions to it.
It's not because there's a misunderstanding of how complicated this problem is, right? I am not making the claim that Saudi support for a particular version of Islam is the only means by which individuals become radicalized. I completely agree that sits inside or on top of political constructs that are important as well. But the mere fact that it existed for a long time in a peaceful form doesn't mean that ultimately it was the spark that ended up lighting this problem that we have today. There are lots of hazards in your house that don't catch on fire until something gets attached to it. And then all of a sudden you realize that you shouldn't have had it sitting in your basement that whole time. So I think the challenge for us is that we have to make policy choices, right? So when the rubber hits the road, we have to make decisions about who our allies are and who they aren't, what issues we prioritize and which ones we don't. And my critique is that we simply have focused so much of our time in Congress focused on Shia extremism, focused on Iran as a progenitor of instability in the region, that we have missed a really important debate about the way in which the Saudis have spread a message that has been terribly unhelpful to our fight against extremism. And that doesn't mean that we can ask more of them than we can eventually get. It just means that, for all of the time, as we are again this week spending on sanctioning Iran for their malevolent behavior in the region, coming a week after we wrapped our arms even more tightly around the Saudis, there probably is room for a little more nuanced, a little bit more fair-minded debate, and that's what. Listen, I think we're getting closer to that in this discussion. I just wish more of my colleagues could be here to hear this and act upon it. So, with that, I'm going to go scoot and
go
vote.
tell them, and thank you very much. Thank you. So, yes.
Hi, my name is Maida Ruge. Having lived in Saudi Arabia for 2 years, there was a question I was dying to ask precisely on that front, and that is, in a society in which gender separation is a norm, and the conservative parts of the society would uphold that norm, why would a father or an uncle allow his daughter to sit in a car unaccompanied with a foreign man who is not a cousin, not a brother, not even a Saudi, mostly Pakistani, Indian, or Filipino?
Hi, thank you for taking my question. My name is Ralston Huff, and I'm here on behalf of the Embassy of Iraq today. And my question is, 2 days ago, the Financial Times came out with a report that a possible motivation for the recent break in GCC relations with Qatar is that it has come to light that Qatar may have used a hostage trade with various Shia militias and Iran in order to facilitate the transfer of over $1 billion to various Iraqi militia groups and Iranian-backed militia groups and even al-Qaeda affiliates that Saudi Arabia deems unacceptable. So my question to the three of you is, do you think that there is a kernel of truth to these claims, or is this more of sort of the propaganda war that we've seen recently developing between Saudi Arabia and Qatar leading up to the break in relations?
And yes, the gentleman in the third row.
Hi, my name is Khalid. I'm a student at the George Washington University. And throughout the discussion, we heard that you would have different forms of Salafism. Some people are the loyal Salafists to the state. Some are the violent ones. And recently, there was an article that was published in light of the recent terrorist attacks in France. There was an article published at the Hertz by Oliver Roy, who's a French expert on terrorism, and he asked the question that, so throughout his research for European-born jihadis, these young people are radical before choosing Islam, and then he coined this term. He said, it's the Islamification of radicalism that we need to investigate, not the radicalization of Islam. So I would like to hear thoughts on that.
You know, your question is a very good one. What I said was that women driving is a wedge issue. In other words, it's one that both the conservative and reactionary elements in society use, and it stands for more than just women driving because it represents how powerful they are as a constituency vis-a-vis the government. But the government is also very able to use such issues to push its own agenda. You know, so the government has many instruments, like any government, to dominate its society. And one of them is the claim of conservative religious values. So sometimes the government uses these to better control society or to promote one sector of society over another, and so on. So it's, you know, the Saudi government is a very able, very powerful government, and it has both coercive and co-optational capacities. And that should never be forgotten. Now, the specific question you asked me, though, is an Islamic legal question, right? So why is it that these conservative people allow their girls or their women folk to sit in cars with, let's say, Pakistani, Filipino, or Indian drivers, and that's not considered a violation of the ikhtilat, you know, which is the kind of mixing of genders and sexes, which is forbidden in Islam. My understanding is that they do a kind of a legal kind of form of argumentation where they neuter the person. The driver is almost like a slave. There is an argument for why you can permit it, but you know, look, religious people and like all people are full of contradictions, and to expect utter, complete, logical, kind of seamless argumentation and sentiments is, I think, a very high expectation, both for Saudis as well as for non-Saudis.
I wonder if either Greg or Simon would like to comment on the particular suggestion that was made about Qatari involvement with groups facilitating payments to Shiite militias or others. There have been other reports that have surfaced about statements attributed to the emir, which he didn't make. Any thoughts that either of you have about what's real and what isn't in the allegations about Qatar's behavior?
Everything was fairly real until a couple of weeks ago, since when nothing has been real. The FT story on this money from Qatar to groups in Iraq is a fascinating story. I read it with great interest. There are clearly, money was transferred apparently because there is an accompanying, there's been another story with Qatari suitcases turning up in Baghdad airport full of dollar bills, although curiously the FT story said they couldn't make a connection between this and that. And there were Qataris who were held by armed groups in Iraq, and those Qataris have now, and a few random other Gulfies, have now been released. So something has gone on. The spin which I think the FT put on it was to say this was the basis for the current row. This was the straw which broke the proverbial camel's back, that the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates were utterly exasperated by Qatar for handing over hundreds of millions of dollars to fund groups which either pro-Iranian or certainly antagonistic towards countries like themselves. I think that's an interesting thought, but as yet, at least in my mind, it's not a established number one reason. But then on the current crisis, there's so much that I don't know, I don't know whether it's true or false, that I hesitate to make any sweeping judgment of where the hell we are.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think we have a lot of posturing and disinformation right now amongst the GCC states, which cannot be an encouraging thing for Americans or for President Trump, who just came back from this trip, claiming that he had put together a nice coalition, not only to confront, terrorism, but also to confront Iranian influence and expansionism in the region, and then to have key members of this coalition kind of going at each other through leaking and disinformation has to be disheartening. The driving issue, that single hypocrisy, right, of the driving issue is so glaring that in all my time in Saudi Arabia, when I've confronted people with it, they haven't been willing to deal with it because it is so glaring. And we know, you don't even have to read Arabic. You can just read The Girls of Riyadh to know that things go on in those cars. But I think, yeah, that's what they say.
So, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah. So read The Girls of Riyadh. I think that the approach that's going to get us around, or get the Saudis around, the driving issue is economic. To the extent that this issue is framed as an economic issue, as women in the workforce, as the productivity of society, right? That's the way you're going to get around these cultural restrictions. That's the way you're going to be able to negotiate the third rail of Saudi politics. So it's going to be women with jobs, and they can drive during daylight, and only in certain, that's going to be the start. And then if it changes, I think it's going to be that way. Olivier Waugh, right? Olivier Waugh is one of France's leading interpreters of Islam and Islamist politics. But I think that this notion that you're radicalized and then you kind of adopt a platform is an extremely cogent explanation for the European phenomenon, right? Where you have, especially in the French context, the disillusionment of not being included in society, of not being able to get that good job, of living in the banlieues, right? I don't want to say that these people are oppressed, but they're not sharing in this vision of what French society could be. Or if you're living in Barking in London, you're not sharing in the grand Canary Row, Canary Wharf, vision of modern London. I think that's a really cogent sociological insight for where European Islamist radicalism comes from. I don't know if it fits in the Middle East itself, because the sociological elements are so different, right? I don't think that you have the same kind of correlation between lower and lower middle class economic status and recruitment into jihadist networks. What little I know about jihadist networks in Saudi Arabia, much of which I learned from the excellent work of Thomas Heghammer, who's whose book I can recommend to you, Jihad in Saudi Arabia, is that there really isn't a class basis for this. It tends to be more kind of the personalized networks and mobilization of ideas. I mean, you're mobilized because you in fact see your brothers and sisters being slaughtered, right? Maybe it was in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Maybe it's in Syria today. And so I think that I'm less acceptant of the Olivier Waugh thesis to explain jihadist recruitment in the region itself.
Before I turn back to the audience for three final questions, I want to just ask Bernie if he'd comment on the reports that have surfaced over the last year that are very hard to assess, that the authority of the religious police, Mutaween, has been to some extent circumscribed. What's your judgment? Simon, if you also have thoughts on that, I'd be interested.
Yeah, I mean, the religious police, the Matawi'a, otherwise known as the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice squads, they had arresting rights. I mean, they could see something in the street and they could arrest you and haul you in. And then, you know, if you're a girl on your own, they could call your father in and then make you promise that you're not going to do whatever it was you were doing that they considered immodest or un-Islamic. They have been stripped of their arresting powers. So the only thing that a religious policeman can do, or this religious squad person can do, is if he sees something wrong, he can call the police, and the police can then arrest the person. So they've effectively been neutered in terms of their social, you know, their power in the public space, and that's a significant diminution in their power, and frankly, it has been a relief for many Saudis, especially women, that this has happened. And I see this as a signal. Again, you know, reading Saudi politics is a lot like criminology in the old days of the Soviet Union. You have to see this as a signal that the government is pushing in a certain direction. Again, for economic reasons, I think that's how it'll be framed. But my sense, especially with the young, you know, Deputy Crown Prince, he really believes that if the country is going to move ahead, this kind of residue of the past has to be eliminated. And again, not for ideological commitments to feminism or to liberalism, but because of necessity.
Simon, does that seem right to you?
Well, that's a little too elaborate. The thing that I've heard, which I believe to be true, is that they realized that far too many of the Saudis going to fight with ISIS in Syria and Iraq or elsewhere had backgrounds in the religious police, and so they decided to curtail which stopping their powers of arrest was one part.
My name's Tim Linderking. I'm from the Department of State, and really I just had 3 comments. I don't really have a question. I hope that's okay.
If the academic way to do that is just make your comments and say, what do you think?
Anyway, I work on Saudi Arabia here in Washington. I've also spent a couple of years there quite recently. I think it's great that Senator Murphy makes the comment, even though we heard that he has a lot of qualms with Saudi Arabia. He did acknowledge the benefit that the United States derives from the relationship. And I just want to really echo that because, you know, a lot of that may not be necessarily be in the limelight and so forth, but I think we really have a very powerful connection with the Saudis in a variety of ways, and it does yield tremendous benefit to the United States. Secondly, when we are engaged with Saudi Arabia, it really does yield a lot of results. And I think that, you know, people have a misconception somehow that our engagement is primarily in security or in intelligence, but it's really across the board. Recently, you had the Saudi Minister of Housing in town. We talk about economics, commercial, you know, commercial relations, banking, all of that is really important. But it also, when the Saudis feel comfortable with the U.S. relationship, it enables conversations on these very hard topics to go forward. It creates space for these kinds of hard topics. And so the kinds of things that we're talking about here, whether it's religion or Salafism or human rights, is all part of what we talk about with the Saudis. And the third point is I really encourage people who watch Saudi Arabia from close or afar to let go of, old notions of the kingdom, because I think the kingdom is changing. I think it's very easy to stereotype. We can fasten on the women's driving issue and say wholesale things about Saudi society based on that. But I think if people are willing to delve down and get into some of the changes that you all, I think, have elucidated, you'll find that it will force you to be more flexible in the way that you view the society.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Carter Banker, and I'm from the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. I have two quick questions. The first is, I've been doing a little research into these couple of centers that have opened recently in Saudi Arabia. The sort of very high-profile one being the sort of now famous internet meme of Donald Trump and various world leaders around with their hands on the glowing
orb.
globe. And that was for the opening of the Global Center for Countering Extremist Ideology. And right around the same time, they also opened the King Solomon Center for International Peace in Malaysia, but it was very much a partnership between the two countries. And they're also, within the month, have opened the Ideological War Center in the Ministry of Defense. But I've been reading a lot about these organizations, tried to find as much as I can in English language sources at least, and looked through their brochures. They're extremely vague, say things like, we're going to use very advanced technology to track down extremists on the internet. So using a lot of words to say basically nothing. And to me, these look very much sort of like fronts to sort of appease their allies in the West. And I'm wondering whether you think that these actually are fronts or real efforts to counter violent extremism. And my second question has to do with something that
Please keep this short because we want to let other people.
Okay, yeah. My second quick question is just something that was mentioned earlier, the fact that when we sort of have the ability to approach Saudi about issues and they've changed things, and I know that this happened with Saudi textbooks in 2013 when the State Department approached them about very problematic material, and then they did reform their education system. But what are we supposed to do about the books that have been exported all over the world before this happened? Case in point, Pakistan and Indonesia. And these books are very fundamental in the curriculums there. What do we do about that?
Good. And the gentleman in the check shirt. Stand up.
I guess similar question, Thomas Winnow, Stratus Advisors. Is it plausible that ostensibly private Saudi funding of radical Sunni groups is part of a covert, aggressive strategy to expand Saudi Arabia's regional hegemony?
So there are three comment from the gentleman from the State Department, and then two comments really focused on what are there underlying motives for Saudi actions. What about these centers for counterterrorism? Any thoughts you've got about, I think, the broad question of Saudi counterterrorism efforts? I'm going to throw in one final question from me and then let you make final comments. And that question really goes to this week's news, today's news in particular. General Petraeus famously asked on the way to Baghdad in 2003, how does this end? And every time I see another round of escalation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I ask that same question. Does this end with Saudi Arabia becoming strong enough and self-confident enough that it can balance the region? You go to Tehran and the answer you get is it ends when the House of Saud, an unpopular monarchy, is no more. You go to Riyadh and you get a similar answer. It ends when the Iranian Revolution is reversed. But I'd be interested in your three smart people, your answers to that, in addition to the questions from the audience. And Simon, why don't you lead off?
My goodness, so I'll be selective about what I respond to. You can go back to the 70s, the 60s. There was rivalry in the area when the Shah was there, but there wasn't open hostility, which there is now. The challenge of the Gulf at the moment is that Iran is not a status quo power. It wants to change the Middle East. The Middle East isn't in the form that it would like to see it. And so it is undermining, challenging Saudi Arabia, indeed the United States as well. Tehran's vision of the region is one which doesn't include a role for the Fifth Fleet, for example. Whereas Saudi Arabia is indeed very much a status quo power. It comes with, as we've discussed today, baggage, but it essentially is an ally of the United States. So the choice for us is relatively easy. We can't work with Iran because they don't like us, but we can work with the Saudis even if they're awkward. It's not a great choice, but it's at least an intellectual one.
Greg. So I do have to take exception to the phrase using a lot of words to say nothing. That's a direct attack on the whole academic enterprise, and that you're right to be skeptical of all of these announcements of organizations. Every new king, every new leader wants to have his organization, right? King Abdullah set up very similar organizations. I don't know if they're going to work in tandem with these new organizations or somehow differently. We do know that the Saudis have been, very active on this de-radicalization thing since the mid-2000s, with some success and plenty of failures. But they and the Egyptian government have both worked on this, and there's something to be learned from that. I think that the impulses at the top level in Saudi Arabia in terms of international cooperation for countering violent extremism, to use the American phrase, are good. I mean, I think they want to do this because it's a threat to them in the same way that it's a threat to us. The question is, the way they see doing it and the way lots of people in the United States see doing it are different. And I don't think they're incompatible, but I think that we have to accept the fact that the Saudis are going to deal with this question within the context that they don't think Salafism is a bad religion. They don't think Salafism is the wrong interpretation of Islam. They don't think Salafism leads to terrorism the way I think Senator Murphy would assert. Regional hegemony. If anybody's closer to regional hegemony right now, it's Iran, not Saudi Arabia. The Iranians have been extremely good at utilizing non-state actors to advance their foreign policy aims. These non-state actors can be extremely close to Iran, like Hezbollah. They can be somewhat peripheral to Iran, like the Houthis. They can be nascent, like the popular mobilization units in Iran. But it's the Iranians' ability to use these non-state actors that I think has given them the upper hand in the politics of a region where I think that the dominant, most important political reality is the collapse of authority. And it's how you play into these civil wars that's seen as the key as to who's going to win the contest for regional leadership, regional hegemony, if you will. And the Saudis have not been able to do that, right? Because for the Saudis, the problem is their natural allies among the non-state actors hate them and want to kill them, right? ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these guys, they hate the Saudis and they want to kill them. And thus the Saudis have no reliable non-state actors that they can work with. And we've seen that, I think, in the Syrian civil war. I think we're seeing it to some extent in the Yemen context. And that's why I think the Iranians have the upper hand here. And so how does it end? I think it ends with the reconstruction of state authority in these places, which means it's not going to end anytime soon. The first step has to be some kind of political agreement, right, to stop fighting. And that means bringing in the regional powers, and that includes Iran. You can't isolate Iran if you want a Syrian solution. You can't isolate Iran if you want a Yemeni solution, because the anti-Iranian forces, right, Saudis, Emiratis, us helping them, we're not strong enough to defeat Iran's proxies, allies who are supported also by Russia now. So I think we have to take a 10 to 20-year time horizon on this. The reconstruction of state authority is what stopped civil wars, right? And the stopping of the civil wars is what's going to reduce the reliance of Iraqi, Arab, Shia parties and governments on Iran. It's going to reduce, right, Yemeni, the reliance of the Houthis on outside help. But I don't have the formula for how we end these things.
Bernie, last word.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say something about the Saudi effort to at counterterrorism and counter-radicalization. There is an existing institution that deals with this, actually, several efforts, mainly out of the Ministry of the Interior, who are extremely effective at monitoring the internet and surveying their own society and catching people who are going to join either Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And the Saudis have been involved with tens, if not hundreds, of actual skirmishes and military battles with either ISIS or Al-Qaeda members within Saudi Arabia, who have targeted security personnel and state centers and officials and so on. So this new effort, I think, is a duplication, perhaps, of what already exists. It may have to do with the internal structures of the Saudi government. I don't think that this is a flash in the pan. My understanding is that this new counterterrorism center has already hired over 1,000 people. There's a palace in Mecca that has been dedicated and designated for this center. I don't think it's a white elephant, although, as I said, it may be duplication of existing effort. Now, I want to answer the question of how does it end. One of President Obama's legacies is that he wanted to lessen the U.S. footprint in the region and build up the capacity of allies, as the senator mentioned, with the arms sales to the Saudis. And I think the Saudis have taken one lesson from Obama very seriously, which is that they can no longer rely blindly on the United States for the protection and safeguarding of their regime and of their country. So they do have to build up their military capacity, but that's a decade-long effort, if not more. But that's certainly something they're working on, with which ultimately to confront Iran. But the problem with Iran, as pointed out earlier by both of my colleagues, is that Iran uses non-state actors and is very good at using non-state actors. And the non-state actors that Iran uses adhere to the theology of the Islamic Republic. And in that theology, which is called Wilayat al-Faqih, when the supreme leader in Iran issues a command, you must obey him. If you don't obey him, you sin. So the entire network, for instance, of Hezbollah in the world, of fighters, are people who are dedicated and committed to this ideology and believe in it blindly. And that gives them a command and control capacity that the Saudis don't have, because the Saudis have learned one lesson from the war in Afghanistan, which is that if you build a non-state actor capacity like you did with the Arab Afghans, they come back and bite you in the backside. And this is the classic problem of blowback. So I think that there's going to be a continuation of proxy wars between Iran and Saudi Arabia. My one big fear of how it ends, and I hope it doesn't end like this, is, and here I speak as an American, is for the United States to be dragged into the region in a war against Iran. Because I think that we are, a lot of the indications point to this. And I think that would be something to be very gravely worried about. Let me end by saying one thing, which is that, again, as an American, I think we're confronted in this region by two regional hegemons, Iran and Saudi Arabia. On the one hand, with Iran, you have a regime that is revolutionary, whose very DNA is to call for the death of the United States, death of America, wants to see the Fifth Fleet out of the region, wants to control the choke points, the maritime choke points of the region. Iranians are in Yemen not because they love the Houthis and Houthis are fellow Shiites. They're there also because Bab al-Mandab is a crucial lifeline for the global economy, and they want to be able to control it, or at least hinder it if they want to, just like they can with the Hormuz Straits. So the other thing about Iran is that they kidnap U.S. and imprison U.S. citizens all the time and blackmail us. by doing this. I mean, someone from my own university is now in their prisons. So, you know, we have a regime that basically uses non-state actors, blackmails and imprisons U.S. citizens, uses terror systematically, but with plausible deniability because it's other non-state actors who are doing this, wants us out of the region, wants to control the straits and maritime shipping, is building a nuclear bomb, or will be as soon as this deal is either revoked or ends in some 10 years, versus Saudi Arabia, which is a country that invests its money in the United States, wants American domination of the region, denominates its oil in dollars. If the Saudis were to not denominate their oil in dollars, it would be a huge blow to the reserve currency power of the United States. Buys military equipment from the United States, sends hundreds of thousands of students to study in the United States. I mean, the list of what Saudi Arabia has done and does and continues to do with the United States goes on and on and on, despite all the warts and problems that we had mentioned earlier. So I really, frankly, don't think there's a choice here in the matter.
So I just want to conclude this by thanking my panelists, Senator Murphy in his absence, and thanking our host. This has been, from my standpoint, an unusually frank and interesting discussion about tough problems. I wish every issue in Washington got as much real discussion as we've just given to the question of Saudi Arabia, terrorism, and the future of the region. So thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you.
Fun.